ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's live event with Sue Monk Kidd, author of the Book of Longings. I'm Kathy Jones, one of the Adult Services librarians, and I want to remind everyone that you can register for all of our upcoming programs at hudsonlibrary.org. We have Al Roker, who's going to be here on Monday, and Erin Brockovich will be with us on April 22nd, which is Earth Day. You can register for those right now. I also want to remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen if you're watching on Zoom. If you're watching us on Facebook, you can put your questions in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. And I also want to remind you that our local bookstore, the Learned Owl, will be selling copies of Sue's book, and there's a link in the chat if you would like to purchase one. So tonight, I'm so excited to welcome New York Times bestselling author Sue Monk Kidd. Her debut novel, The Secret Life of Bees, spent more than 100 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was turned into both a major motion picture and a musical. The Mermaid Chair was a #1 New York Times bestseller. It was adapted into a television movie. The Invention of Wings, and Oprah's Book Club 2.0 pick, was also a #1 New York Times bestseller. Her new book, The Book of Longings, was deemed by the Associated Press an epic masterpiece that is a triumph of insight and storytelling. AARP calls it provocative, passionate, and extremely moving, adding, "This is both a love story for the ages and a portrait of a woman way ahead of her biblical times." I would also like to introduce our moderator, Amanda Flower. She is the USA Today bestselling and Agatha Award-winning author of over 35 mystery novels. Her novels have received starred reviews from Library Journal, Publishers Weekly, and Romantic Times, and she's been featured in USA Today and Women's World. In her former life, she was a librarian extraordinaire and is a much missed colleague here at the Hudson Library. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Sue Monk Kidd and Amanda Flower.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for your introduction. I just want to thank the Hudson Library for hosting this program for us and encourage you to sign up for their virtual programs. They've been doing a fantastic job during this really bizarre time in our history, and we are so grateful for them. And also, I want to thank you, Sue, for being here. Virtually, we can reach all over the world, but I'm really excited that you have taken this time to be and speak to our patrons in Northeast Ohio. So thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Thanks. Your new book, your newest book, it actually came out a year ago in hardcover, the Book of Longings, and it came out in paperback last week, correct?
That's right.
And it was such a moving story, and on a personal note, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this story, to me at least, was about feminism, although feminism wasn't a word in the first century, and religion, and how it might have been different if women were in leadership roles at the beginning of the church. And for me, that is a really interesting thing because it's something that I've thought of since I was a very young child, because I was raised by my mother, who was a Presbyterian minister. In 1974, she was ordained when there weren't a lot of women clergy. So women in the church and religion has been something that's been a major part of my life. And as a young girl, I fiercely defended her when she was questioned. And I continue to defend women clergy to this day. So my first question for you really is, you had this major success with The Secret Life of Bees, your memoirs and everything else you write. What made you brave enough to write this story about a novel about Jesus's wife? Like, what brought you to do that?
I was inspired. That's all I can say. I just got very inspired. I think it was probably a combination of things, from an initial inspiration that I'll tell you about, to my history, my own experiences with what you were just talking about, Amanda, my history with the church and the lack of female leadership and feminine language and feminine sacred icons and images, so many things. And actually wrote a book about that, The Dance of the Dissident Daughter.
Yeah.
So it was in me to do. But then one day I was reading this article in National Geographic about an ancient papyrus fragment that a Harvard professor, Dr. Karen King, had introduced to the world as believing it to be authentic. In it, Jesus refers to his wife. Turns out it was not authentic. It was a very good forgery. But when I read the article, that seemed kind of irrelevant to me at the time. What struck me and really kind of electrified me when I thought of it was, what if he did have a wife? She would be the most silenced woman in the history of the world. You know, if she existed. It didn't really strike me as, at the moment, as important whether he had a wife or didn't have a wife. I don't know that to this day, and I don't think anyone probably ever will, maybe.
Right.
But I was struck by the need to imagine it. And I think that imagining alternate histories like that is very important for us to do, because it kind of gives us new possibilities and ways of thinking, and opens our world up to new ideas.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think the world would have been different if we had known if Anna had been real and she had been part of the story going through, the last 2,000 some years of Christian history?
Well, we can only speculate, but I'm utterly convinced the world would be quite different.
Mm-hmm.
That was a question that I wrote on a 3x5 card and propped on my desk. How would the world be different if she had really existed and she had been, and we'd known her story, and she'd been a full partner throughout this whole thing in history? I believe that women would have been far more included, that we wouldn't have to be talking so much about the lost feminine within religion.
Mm-hmm.
I think women's voices and stories probably wouldn't have been as marginalized. I doubt we'd have celibate priests. I mean, we could go on and on.
Right.
I think the abyss, really, the chasm between sexuality and sacredness would probably not be such a problem in the church as in some places in the church. Virginity is one of the highest values. I think all of that would have probably been different.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm sure when you were crafting the character of Anna, you were very mindful of the fact that there were to be the spouse, the partner to Jesus, there were going to be certain qualities that this individual is going to have in order to be his partner, essentially. So what were those qualities, and as you were creating her, were there any characteristics that through the writing process that came to you that surprised you, that she just kind of, as the character, added them on and gave you a little bit of a shock?
Well, the first thing I realized is that if I was going to actually partner her with Jesus, she was going to have to be pretty special. She needed to be luminous, large, and be able to have her own quest, her own vision. So I tried to create a character that was exceptionally gifted. She taught herself to read. She could speak several languages. She had ambitions to be a scribe and to write women's stories. So I gave her a longing to do that in a time when that really wasn't allowed for her. Right. She was also daring and brave, kind of an audacious character. She was dogged too. I think she was sometimes a little stubborn. I mean, she was flawed, but she was mostly, her heart longed not only to have this relationship with Jesus, but to also realize her own inner largeness and her own potential. So that was the kind of person I thought it was important to create, to kind of be on a parity in a way with his humanity.
Mhm. So you mentioned the largeness, and it comes up in the story, quite a few times, her largeness and how Jesus recognized it and she recognized it in him. For you, what is that? And is it something that's unique to them, or is it something that can be found in other individuals or in other places too?
Well, my own feeling is that this largeness, as Anna and her aunt Yaltha call it, is something like a particular genius that everyone has. I'm all for demystifying the word genius. It's not just special men that have this and one woman. That was when I looked up female genius and they asked me did I mean the band Female Genius. If you look that up, you'll find that most of the listing of names are male. And there's always one, Madame Curie is always on there, however. So I thought, why not demystify this and let us all recognize that we each have a kind of passion or ability or potential inside of us. And let's call it our particular genius. And I really do believe everyone has that. And Anna wanted to realize hers. And maybe part of why we're here is to try to understand what that is and to actualize it. So, yeah, I think her prayer was, bless the largeness in me, no matter how I fear it.
It's beautiful. And so you mentioned her aunt Yaltha, and she's a wonderful character. She was very fun to read. And I've heard in other interviews, you kind of call her your Anna's spiritual midwife and helps her on her journey. Could the story have been written if you hadn't included Yaltha? Was she like an essential piece to move the story forward to help Anna along her way?
In my mind, she definitely was. In fact, Anna collects a women as she goes through the story. And by the end, she has her own community or little family. And that is very characteristic of what I write. I mean, from the time I wrote The Secret Life of Bees, there was a community of women. There have been in every book. But in this one particularly, it was very strong. And Yaltha was important to Anna as an encourager, as someone who blessed her largeness. And, she said, we all kind of need that too, not just to recognize our own largeness, but we need at least one person to kind of bless it for us. Mm-hmm. And she encouraged Anna's audacities, and she went through the entire story with Anna. And I think she was sometimes a counterpoint. Sometimes we find that the plot is revolving around one of her stories. I mean, she carries a big secret, and this slowly unravels through the story, but she's essential to Anna.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the other women that she collects along the way. There's Tabitha and others. Who are the other? Do you feel like they're all essential, or are there certain ones that were special to you that you really think made a difference for Anna in her journey?
Well, some of the female characters in the book are there because I want to emphasize that their stories weren't told, that they kind of fell through the cracks of history and they didn't get their story told. And I wanted to emphasize, well, how would the world be different if women had been the storytellers? How would history have been different? I think we would have seen a lot of different things. So that was part of it. But some of the women in the story are important for the plot, not just Yaltha. There's a character named Phasaelus, who was married to Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee. Mm-hmm. And she's pretty interesting figure. And I did a lot of research on her. I mean, she did live and she did some daring things, but we never really hear much about it. And that was part of the plot, where the plot actually turned on some connection that Anna has with her where something, of course, goes astray. And then there's an Egyptian woman, Diodora, who serves the priestess, she serves the priestess of Isis. And, that allowed me to sort of dabble in what was going on in the world beyond the Judaistic world. It was a world of many religions.
And you're speaking of many religions, and I'm not sure everyone in Christianity has heard of an incantation bowl before. I might be saying that wrong. So could you explain the importance of that and how helps Anna feel connected to her spirituality?
An incantation bowl was something that really existed back even pre-Jesus life. I mean, in the early several hundred years BCE. They are bowls that people would write prayers inside, and they would write them in sort of a circular way around the inside of the bowl, and draw pictures occasionally to represent the prayer at the bottom. Sometimes there were curses that they wrote in the bowl on people. They were often prayers or longings, and I didn't know about them either. I stumbled upon them on the internet one day while I was doing some research. And I was really taken with this idea because I realized that this bowl, Anna could put her longing, her deepest longing in that bowl as a prayer, and that it could become a kind of icon that could go with her through the book as a concrete, symbolic kind of thing. And it's pretty important to her, really important, so much so that she carries it. It's too big to put in her pack, so she has to carry it in her hands all the way to Egypt.
Poor thing. Another character in your story is Judas Iscariot, which of course in Christianity is known as the disciple who betrayed Jesus. And your take on him is interesting because he is the adopted brother of Anna. And how did you decide to make kind of his, I would say, his sad history, with his parents, what happened to his parents, and then kind of his political agenda going forward? How did you decide to create him and maybe humanize him a little bit more than it's been through Christian history?
I thought it was important to humanize all of the characters that we might know. I'll start by saying I wanted to humanize the figure of Jesus tremendously, because we seem to be more familiar with his deity than we are with his humanity. And I think we've lost a little touch with that. So that was one reason I focused on the humanity of Jesus. But I wanted to humanize Judas too. I feel like he's been a one-dimensional figure in Christianity, the evil betrayer, and I wanted to give him a plausible reason for his actions so that we might have at least a smidgen of sympathy or empathy for this figure. So I gave him this background that is not too far probably from what a lot of scholars are speculating, that he was very anti-Rome. And so I imagined that he had suffered greatly at the hands of Rome. And so in this story, I have his mother enslaved by the Romans and carried off after a rebellion in Sepphoris, which was the capital of Galilee, and his father crucified. And there was actually a rebellion around that time in which they crucified hundreds of men in the city. And I just thought if you had that kind of traumatic history, you might feel a lot of hatred and resistance to the Roman occupation. And so it became a political theater in a way of Judas wanting to use Jesus in a way to accomplish that. So, he doesn't get off lightly in the story, but at least we kind of understand him a little better, I hope.
Yeah, and I personally like that because it's always been difficult for me, knowing the story of Judas, to think Jesus picked him as a disciple just for this end game. And I feel like he would have seen some redemptive quality in him. So I did appreciate that you did that and gave him some backstory and reason, just that he wasn't pure evil, which I think is, been the narrative for a long time. So to talk a little bit about your other writing as well, you've also written nonfiction. You talked about your memoir, or one of your memoirs, another one you wrote with your daughter. And you've both written fiction and nonfiction. So what draws you to write one or the other? Are you like, I wrote a fiction book, I need a break and I need to write nonfiction? Or is it the story pulls you? How do you know what to write next, since you've written probably more than other authors a variety of subject matters or characters, even though women has been the thread throughout?
Yeah, I've said sometimes people say, your stories are so radically different. Mm-hmm. And I say, well, they're different on the outside, but they're pretty alike on the inside. The same motifs seem to run through a lot of them, even though the time and place and characters are very different. I kind of feel like it's important for me to write from what I call the inside out. So I'm waiting on some image or idea to strike me to really capture my imagination. And when that happens, I'll play with it for a while to see if it's going to stick and sprout, and make a story. Because it takes me sometimes 3 years on average to write a novel. I hope as I get older, I'll realize I have to go faster. Right now, I seem to be in this 3-year process. And when you do that, you better like the idea a lot and make sure it's sustainable because you're with it a long time. So I kind of wait on that, and I never know if it's going to be fiction or nonfiction. I really love writing both. What I love is story, whether it's trying to imagine stories and characters, or whether it's memoir and I get to be the character and tell my story. I think they're all important to me to do, because I think story is crucial to healing the world and even individual lives. And we need to articulate our stories. I think everyone in some fashion needs to tell their story. So I never know which one it's going to be until that idea comes.
So you said it takes you about 3 years to write a book. So what is that process like? Are you actively researching down a road, or are you just sitting with the idea for a few months and just not actively working on, let it kind of in the subconscious bounce around a little bit? So how do you get from that kernel of an idea to, what we have here today, a finished product?
Well, I count the day that I sit down and say, okay, I'm starting. I'm actively engaged in, that's day one. And that includes doing research and doing the reading for background that I need to do. It includes making storyboards, and I'm just notorious for my elaborate storyboards. I think it's just fun. It may be a delay tactic too, I don't know. And I do collages of my books. I write character sketches and create timelines and plot lines and all, just fill up notebooks with notes. I get a title and then I can start working. This book took me 4.5 years to write. It was my longest book, and that's because I spent 14 months researching this book. It was a multi-layered, highly textured, necessary thing to do because there was the political background, just the daily living, the world of Judaism in the first century, the historical Jesus. I mean, what were women like? I tried to make this as authentic and accurate as possible and layer in all kinds of details to give it the sense of being real, a real place. I like the reader to step into a place and think, oh, this feels right. This is a real world. So I had no idea I was biting off as much as I did because the first century, I mean, even with my Sunday school background and the study I'd done, I had so much to learn. I thought it would take 6 months. It took 14. And then I was able to write for the next 3 years.
So how did you know? I think a lot of writers have this issue when you just, like, I have to stop research and I need to write. How did you know, like, at month 14? Because I'm sure you can read into affinity, especially in this topic. And when did you know that I need to stop and write the book at this point?
Yeah, that's a writer's insight you just had too, because we all know that. In fact, I probably could confess that I could have done the research in less than 14 months. I got carried away. I probably could have done less. But you go down these rabbit holes, and the more you go, the more you learn about that world, and you get comfortable in it as much as possible. And it begins to feel natural to me, so that I'm describing a place where I hang out. And I know not just what they eat, but what they eat on, how they sit at the table or on the ground, where the pottery's made. I mean, I know all these things. But you're right. I had some times when my daughter had to do an intervention on me. She caught me like one day doing some research on Roman aqueducts and irrigation. I mean, how relevant was this to the story? And then 3 days later, she came back and I was still doing aqueducts. And she said, okay, Mom, we need to talk.
How important are aqueducts going to be?
They turn up like once, in the story.
Yeah.
But she was right. I was fascinated, and she pulled me out of this hole I was digging for myself. But I think you can over-research, and maybe it is some kind of unconscious, way to stay away from the writing, which it can be hard, especially the beginnings are hard for me.
Yeah, no, I would agree that the fear of that blank page when you start and you don't really know what's going to happen. Even if you plotted out the story, it's going to take some turns that you unexpect, and it's work. It's really hard work. So to start a new one every time, like, okay, you're ready.
Oh, yeah, I know. I feel like every time I start a new book, I don't know what I'm doing. I feel I don't know how to do this anymore. But, for me, the possibilities are so immense when I get started, because you've got a blank page. That's very daunting. And I like it when just to sort of limit it down to a story that you can tell is painful because it feels so big in your mind, and it's like chaos and you're trying to brood over it. It's a tense feeling, but once I can get about 25 pages under my belt, it feels like I change gears and I can start really working. I know where I'm going. I've set my course.
Yeah, absolutely. So did you feel like, with not maybe all of your stories, but especially with the Book of Longings, was it kind of, you knew you had to write it or it was just going to drive you crazy? Was it that sort of situation?
Oh yeah. I have to feel strongly about every book I write or I'm not going to write them. I mean, there are many books I want to write, but I have to wait for that one that really seizes me. I felt that way about The Secret Life of well, every book I've written.
Mhm.
I felt strongly passionate about writing them. With this book, I was probably more compelled than any book I've written.
Mhm.
I can't exactly explain why. Maybe from what I referenced a little earlier. I think it's important for us to be able to have a feminine lens to look at history and biblical history and religious history. It's so missing. And it's a jolt sometimes, when you see that world open up to you through the eyes of a woman. How would she see it differently? What would she tell? How did she see those events? And, I guess I should say at this point that a lot of people thought it was going to be the story of Jesus told through the eyes of Anna. But that's not what I was after at all. And that's not what the book is. Certainly, he's a character. He's kind of a secondary character, and he doesn't appear through the entire book. But this is Anna's story through and through. And she has her journey to take just as he does. And they have a great love in this story, which I wanted very much. I thought they deserved it,
Mhm.
But I think overall, Anna had her quest, and I wanted that to be realized more than anything. So that's her story to tell, and that was why I, felt compelled.
Mhm. That's wonderful. And I just, as a writer to writer, I'm curious, when you first told your editor, I'm going to write a novel about, the life of Anna, the wife of Jesus. How was that received? Did you feel supported in your decision, moving forward?
I did. They were excited about it. They were all behind me on it. So I appreciated that a lot. My agent told the publisher initially that I was going to bring up. I like to write up a little proposal of what I'm doing. And she said, "You're going to see some kind of red tent thing, and that's all I'm going to tell you." And I think they were thinking it would be some character in the Bible, but not the wife of Jesus. I believe there was a little bit of a ripple of shock through there. But, my husband was the funniest one. When I told him what I was doing, he said, "Oh, great. What could possibly go wrong with that?"
Oh, well, I'm sure, the book's been well received, but I'm sure just because of the subject matter, there's probably been some criticism. But, as a writer, that's part of our existence, isn't it? You just probably are getting at a higher caliber, I assume, with just the subject matter that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I had a little trepidation about what I was doing myself, but
Mhm.
it was overridden pretty quickly because of how strongly I felt about doing this. And I felt like, okay, this is my book to write, and I'm going to write this book.
Yeah.
And nothing really, I never really wanted to turn back ever. Although sometimes I would take my own breath when I'm putting words in Jesus' mouth. I'm thinking, what am I doing? But yeah, I'm sure it's controversial on some fronts, but overall, people have been amazingly receptive to this book and this story of Anna.
That's wonderful. That's really good. Um, to go back to some more of the writing questions, because I know, especially in Hudson, or in the area, there are a lot of people that are pre-published writers are trying to break into the world of publishing, and questions are often like, what's your writing schedule and where do you write? That, yeah, I think everyone's looking for that secret sauce of what's gonna, get them there. So what would yours be? When is it that moment where it's just like so fluid and you feel like you're writing words that are gonna stay, not words that are not gonna make it to the end?
Well, when my daughter, Anne, her name is Ann Kidd Taylor, and she is a writer, and she wanted to write. She asked me this question, and I said, I mean, I've been able to tell her many things, and I actually have learned a lot from her too about writing. But I said, well, first of all, use your authentic voice. Don't write someone else's story. Don't write what you think will sell. Don't write what people tell you is in a book that you should write. Write what is inborn in you to write, your idea. So, there's a place in us, inside of all of us, where we can connect with where our imagination is, our memory, our history, our dreams, our feelings, all of this wealth of things that come together to create a real reservoir for writers to draw on. And images rise up from that. I mean, C.G. Jung said, the imagination is merely the rising up of images from the unconscious. So when these images are coming, sometimes we need to see which ones really capture our imagination and that fascinate us. So whatever fascinates you, whatever comes from within you, play with it and see how it can be developed in a story, because that's unique to you and authentic. And then I told her, be brave. You got to be brave. And, put your voice out there, even when it's painful sometimes. I mean, we've all been rejected and we've all been criticized, but that's not what we're about. We're about putting our words and our voice in the world for, I hope, some kind of noble reason. And that's what we do.
Absolutely. And I think you've been a wonderful example, not just to your daughter, but to all writers, to be brave, because you've certainly proven that with this novel and then with your memoir too. I know that had some reactions to that one as well, your first memoir. I have one more question, and then we do have some questions from the audience that I'd like to get to. But and if this is comfortable for you to answer, I know some writers don't want to talk about what their current project is because they want to hold off. But we are having people ask, what are you working on now? What's the next thing?
Okay. I haven't told my publisher yet, but I'll tell you.
Oh.
My daughter and I are going to co-author a book, nonfiction, a memoir-esque book on writing, creativity, and soul, and how those three things come together. It's kind of the way I've written. We want to just tell the story of how we write, where we get inspiration, how it's connected to this place I was talking about a minute ago. Just, tell our writing secrets. And the story of that. The story of our writing life is really what I'm talking about. So that's up. That's what I'm working on.
I'm excited for that because
good.
I love to read how other writers work, and then also recognize too, as a writer, that we're all completely unique how we do it, and that there's no right way, but you can get guidance and directed in your right way from another writer. So I'm looking forward to that, and I know the audience will be too, because like I said, there's a lot of pre-published people that are watching tonight. Some of our reader questions that we have, one of the readers asked if you've been to Israel. So did your visit inform at all the story in the Book of Longings?
I have been to Israel. I cannot tell you how many years ago it was, though. It wasn't a recent trip that I took. it was with my mother in 1980 something. So it was a long time ago. I wanted to go back as I was preparing to write the book, but the timing was not right in the world or in my life to do that. So I just pulled out my journals, and you remember the old slideshows you used to do? Mm-hmm. You put them in the carousel. I still had my old carousel of slides from that trip. And I pulled that out. I don't know how long it had been since I'd seen it. And it all came flooding back to me, the landscape and just the feeling tones of everything there. And my journal that I kept, that helped me surprisingly, even though it had been so long. And on that trip, I was also in Egypt as well. Okay. So I guess, yes, I was there, even though it was a long time ago.
Yeah. I mean, of course, that would still inform, what you wrote, because once you came back to those memories, like the smell, the dryness in the air, all those things would have come back to from your memories. So that I think that's, a beautiful thing that you saved those things. I think sometimes people don't save those, precious memories as much anymore.
Oh, yeah. I save everything that I've ever written. One day it will be very embarrassing for, my family to read what I've left behind, I'm sure. But my mother, who died last summer at the age of 99.
Wow, I'm sorry.
She went with me on this trip, and I have her journal. And I was able to have her journal to read and write. And she has beautiful descriptions of things I didn't record that, brought back other ideas for me. And I was able to kind of see that trip through her eyes. And I mean, I can see her now. She rode a camel up the hill to the pyramids. I took the bus. She took the camel.
Oh. She had the option for the bus, but she's like, no, I'm taking the camel.
Well, I told her I'd been on a camel before, and that's once is enough. So you get on the camel, I'm taking the bus.
Oh, that's so funny. Your mom sounds like she was a strong woman too.
Yeah.
So also people want to know, what are you reading at the moment? I think readers are always curious about what their favorite authors also read. So,
well, I'm reading two books right now. I'm reading a galley that's coming out April 13th by Paula McLean.
Okay.
Called When the Stars Go Dark. It's really a departure for Paula. She wrote The Paris Wife. And I'm loving it. I really am. It's more of her main character is a detective, but it's beautifully written. And so I would recommend that. And I'm also reading a book called, this kind of actually came out of writing the Book of Longings. It's called After Jesus, Before Christianity. And it's written by a group of scholars about the first 200 years of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And I'm reading it because I'm going to be writing the foreword to it.
Okay.
And it's an excellent and wonderful book as well. So you can look for that next fall. So I guess I'm reading books that aren't out yet. So how helpful is that to you?
Well, we can write them down and we'll be ready. So that's always good. And we have more questions about books that you enjoy. Someone wants to know, like, if there's any memoirs, since you write memoir too, that you recommend.
I just read a memoir that I like a lot. It came out last summer, I believe. Let's see if I can remember her name. Sarah. Okay. But it's called
I put you on the spot.
Yeah, I'll think of it before about midnight tonight.
Yes, of course.
But it's called The Smallest Lights in the Universe. And it's by an astronomer, a woman who is a scientist who loses her husband, and her work intermingling with her grief in the universe. And it's very interesting. So that's a new, recent memoir that I read. But I love to read widely. I like to read literary fiction. I like to read biography. I love to read poetry just for inspiration. I used to read, like, make myself read, not make myself. I wanted to read a poem a day, but it was like a discipline that I made myself do. And I love memoir. I mean, I read across the genres.
That's wonderful. Someone is going back to talking about the book again. She was asking about the character of Tabitha. Is she a documented biblical character, or is it someone from your imagination? Is what happened to her something historical from the time period?
Yeah, Tabitha was a figment of my imagination. And actually, she wasn't in the first draft of the first part. I wrote part 1 of the book, and I felt like it just needed another dimension. And so I created this character of Tabitha, or some people call her Tabitha in New Testament, so that Anna would have this friend who was different than her, who would sort of turn up through her life. Now, I feel sort of bad that I let this tragic thing happen to her. I mean, she made it, and she was redeemed, but she had a terrible trauma. And yes, that was something that happened to women. There are not lots of documented stories about women, period. But I was able to find some references to women certainly being raped and having their tongue cut out, and in biblical times. And if you read the scriptures, the Old and the New Testaments, there are stories of, particularly in the Hebrew scriptures, of women being raped and dismembered and all kinds of, rather terrible things that we don't really talk about or hear about. But it's certainly there. And it was important in the story to have this rather tragic thing happen to Tabitha, but she learned a new way. I mean, it was very moving for me to write her story, actually.
It's wonderful. Not what happened to her, of course, but that you were able to share it in such a beautiful way. And so someone just had a comment that the Dance of the Dissident Daughter, and someone was actually asking the name of your first memoir. So that's the answer for that question. But that she said it changed her life and gave her permission to go on her own spiritual path. So I thought you would like to hear that. Another question we have: did you research man and women relationships from that time, and how did that enlighten your story?
Yes, I had to do that for sure, because I had to understand how marriage happened, betrothals, how they fitted into the laws, the Torah. It was very complicated. I found an amazing book that was written by a professor of Jewish studies. I'm trying to remember what university. It's in Indiana. And it helped me tremendously. It was on marriage in antiquity in the Jewish world. And it was practically the only book I really needed to read, though I read 2 or 3 of them about this. So I would say that the process that I describe in the Book of Longings is pretty spot on about how that was done.
Wow. And when you were doing that research, was there anything that really surprised you that you added into the story, or was it all just kind of overwhelmingly new information?
No, I learned so many new things. I mean, I did know from my background, religious background, that when you were betrothed in the first century Galilee and in Judea, it was as binding as marriage. You actually had to get a divorce if you were betrothed. It was by law. So that was, but you then waited so many months. I think the minimum age was 3 months up to a year before you actually had the marriage itself. So there were things like that. I kind of knew about that. One thing I learned that I found, and I put it in the story actually, I found to be so vivid, was a story of women who couldn't find a betrothed. No one went to their father and asked for their hand. Or if the father wasn't living, they'd go to the oldest brother. And if there wasn't a brother, an uncle, and ask to be married. There were women who didn't have that. And so they would, on a certain day, I think it was in April, it was called the Feast of Av, they would go out in the vineyard in white dresses and dance. And the men would gather and watch and pick out the one
Oh my.
that they thought might make a good wife based on how they danced in the vineyard. I thought, please, okay. So that made its way into the
Yeah. Yeah, that's what probably you're like, I have to use this, but oh my word, like.
Oh yeah, I had many moments like that. Yeah, it was, I mean, women had a hard time of it,
Yeah.
And you were right. There is no word feminism then. However, I'm convinced that women had aspirations and yearnings and longings in their heart, to have opportunities and freedoms, to be able to go where their brothers went. There's a line where Anna says, Judas is her half brother, adopted brother. And so she would say, he can go anywhere he wants, but for me, the whole world is a cage. And that was pretty much true.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So someone actually also wants to know the name of your memoir that you wrote with your daughter. And I'm blanking on it right now, and I want to be able to answer her.
Well, fortunately, I will not blank on that. I would blank on that other memoir, though.
Yeah.
It's called Traveling with Pomegranates.
Traveling with Pomegranates.
Yeah, and it's essentially the story of when Anne and I went to Greece together when I was 50 years old and life was changing for me. I was starting to write fiction. Anne had just graduated from college, and we were both sort of setting out at two ends of life. And so it was a lot of transitions happening, but I try to tell the story of my search for the Black Madonna and the writing of The Secret Life of Bees and things like that. And Anne tells I think, a beautiful story about her process too. It was so much fun to write that together. But it's Traveling with Pomegranates. Yeah.
Traveling with Pomegranates. How was it writing with your daughter? Was it challenging, or was it just, a good experience all around? I mean, obviously you're doing it again, so it must have been positive.
Yeah, must have been. No, it really was. It had its moments where we had to figure out, she'd have one idea, I'd have a different idea. We were figuring out how to do it as we went along. But, it was a very bonding thing in the end. And I think we learned a lot about each other, and we learned how to write a book together. But whenever we told people we're writing a book together, they would say, "And you're still speaking?" There's a whole lot, I think, about mothers and daughters.
Yes.
But the essence of the story, it is also those things I said, but it's also a mother-daughter story of how we as two adult women found one another again. So that's not always easy for mothers and daughters,
Yeah, it's true. So one of our readers' final question is, well, actually one just popped in, so there might be another one, but what are you longing for next in your writing? What do you hope your future works accomplish, or is it continuing the same goal of telling the stories of women?
That's interesting question. I mean, it's a very thoughtful question. And while I'm thinking of that, I want to say thank you to the reader who had that nice comment about the Dance of the Dissident Daughter too. Please know I appreciate that. I think that initially when I was starting out writing, my deepest desire was to write authentically, to write, to give myself to the work and to make the work as excellent as I could. As I got older, really, I think I actually tell this story in Traveling with Pomegranates, I really wanted to think bigger than that, because I was getting of the age where you start thinking about your legacy, your grandchildren. And I wanted my words to count for something. I wanted them to matter. I wanted to make my dent and leave something behind. And that became the most important thing to me. I mean, I'm not always that noble, believe me, but that is a thing I try to go back to over and over, is to serve my work, but to serve something larger than myself too. I think writing can create a new mythology in the world that can change the story. We can change the underlying stories. We can change the world. That's what I mean. And so to give ourselves to that, to this thing larger than us. So what would I most hope for my next book, or any book I've ever written or will write? That it contributes to something larger than I am, that people will say what that wonderful person said earlier, that changed my life, or that made me feel empathy for people who aren't like me, something like that.
Yeah. And I think it has, because we're getting a lot of comments now about people that say how much they love your work and how compelling it is. Elaine says, beautiful writing, thank you. So they are saying it's delightful. So you've accomplished that. And I'm sure you will continue to accomplish that moving forward. And we're looking forward so much to seeing what's next. And from a personal note, I think it's wonderful that I had a very special mother-daughter bond with my own mother. So I think it's wonderful that you are going forward to write with your daughter, because that is so special.
Well, thank you to the library, the Hudson Library, and to you, Amanda, and to every one of you who are listening in on this and asking questions. I'm really grateful. I love my readers. I really do. And I appreciate you being here and being part of this.
And we want to thank you as well for being with us tonight. And Amanda, it was very interesting, informative talk, and it was a pleasure to kind of get to know you both. And thank you also to all of our viewers tonight. And we hope to see you soon at our next, whatever that may be. Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.